8 months ago, I was outside the courthouse when Donald Trump was arraigned in Manhattan.
We are coming on the air with historic news. For the first time ever in American history, a former president of the United States has been indicted.
And since then,
it's another historic moment in a series of historic moments. Former U.S. President Donald Trump indicted again.
A lot more has happened.
For the third time this year, Donald Trump was arraigned in a courtroom. This time, he's facing...
For the fourth time this year, former President Donald Trump is defendant Donald Trump. Late yesterday...
For those not keeping score, Trump has been indicted on 91 felony charges across 4 criminal cases in state and federal courts. At the same time, he's continued to dominate the Republican primary and the party. So, while 2024 could very well be a rematch between Trump and Joe Biden, there's no way it'll be the same election as 2020. Or any election, ever. Considering Trump now faces something like 700 years in prison, at least on paper. Trump's legal status is one of the biggest wild cards heading into next year. So I decided to get a crash course in the law and spend the day in the Times newsroom trying to answer questions it's surreal to even be asking. Like, are Republicans coalescing around a man who might soon be a convicted felon? And how much is set to happen before Election Day? From the New York Times, I'm Ested Herndon. This is The Run-Up. So, here's a tally of Trump's criminal cases. There are 2 state cases in New York and Georgia, and there are 2 federal cases brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith and the U.S. Department of Justice. And while there's no question they've gotten a lot of media attention, what I wanted, as someone focused on 2024, is a clear timeline of how these cases could interact with next year's political calendar. So I packed my day full of meetings with the Times reporters who covered them closely.
Cool. How's it going?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm
good to see you.
It's good to see you, too.
Starting with Jonah Bromwich.
So my name is Jonah Bromwich, and I cover criminal justice in New York State. And so in terms of the criminal cases, I'm focused on the criminal case brought by Alvin Bragg. He's the Manhattan District Attorney, and he was actually the first to charge Donald Trump.
Can you give me a top-line just overview on what that case is about?
Sure. So to remember this case correctly, you really have to remember 2 important characters. One is Stormy Daniels, who I think is the more memorable of the characters. She's a porn star who said that she had had an affair with Trump. The second character, a little less memorable, but still very much so, is Michael D. Cohen. Mm-hmm. This is a guy who was a former fixer for Trump, but then broke with him very dramatically, pleaded guilty to federal crimes, and then accused Trump of committing his own crimes in congressional testimony and elsewhere.
This is like a throwback to season 1 of a television show I have not watched in a long time and have kind of tuned out. I mean, these are all names I remember a few years ago, but have fallen off in my head. I feel like this case centers around a thing I intuitively remember, and I think most people do, which is the allegation that Cohen paid Daniels to be silent about said affair with Donald Trump.
That's right. So we often shorthand that case as the quote-unquote hush money case. Mm-hmm. And that's because in the run-up to the presidential campaign, Cohen paid hush money to Daniels. And the idea of doing so was to suppress this story that could have been embarrassing to Trump and could have hurt his chances as he tried to gain the White House for the first time.
And we know this happened, right?
We do.
So what is this trial about legally?
The issues are essentially that after Cohen made that payment, Trump reimbursed him. And prosecutors have essentially accused him of lying to cover up that reimbursement and thus of covering up a conspiracy that was meant to help him win the 2016 election, his first run for the White House.
So the argument is that because Trump covered up the reimbursement for his payment, that was part of a conspiracy that was meant to keep this out of the public eye and not damage him before the 2016 election.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So can you tell me about the timeline? Like, what are the important dates to know for this case? And like, to be clear, I have a physical calendar here to try to mark some of these down.
There's one really key date, and that's March 25th. That's the day that the Bragg trial is supposed to start.
The Bragg trial is supposed to start March 25th, 2024.
That's right.
Okay.
But I don't think it's going to happen.
Why is
that?
The
reason it's not going to happen is because Trump is supposed to be on trial in federal court early that month, and that trial is supposed to take 2 to 3 months. So if that happens, then the Bragg trial is likely to be pushed back.
because you think it's going to be so massively delayed, from my position as someone who's really concerned about next year and the political calendar, should I be thinking about these other cases more than I'm thinking about the New York case?
No.
Why?
Because there's so much chaos in this entire process that these predictions about what's going to happen are not worth all that much. There's too much going on. Trump could delay one trial, another trial could start, other things could disrupt multiple trials. So I think one safe bet, and we've talked to a lot of experts about this, is that really max, we're going to see 2 trials next year. And I think even that is probably unlikely. But which trials they are, you could probably handicap them. And if I were an odds maker, maybe I'd be better at this. Mm-hmm. But there's too much chaos in the system to really know for sure, oh, don't pay attention to that one, pay attention to this one. I guess the only thing I would say is like, pay attention to the calendar and pay attention to the one that is currently scheduled to start first. Right now, that's the federal case in Washington that accuses him of seeking to overturn the election. As long as that's first, that's the one to focus on.
Okay. So, as you mentioned, this is a whole scope of trials that we're trying to understand today. And so there are some questions I want to ask all of the reporters who cover these things consistently. On the scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least likely, 10 being the most likely, how would you rate Trump's chances of being convicted in this before Election Day?
In my case?
Yes.
Very low.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's a very good chance this trial doesn't happen before Election Day.
Mm-hmm. Because of the likelihood of delays.
Yes.
Thanks, Jonah. Appreciate your time.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me again.
So, technically, the New York case is scheduled for March. But given Jonah's expectation that it'll get pushed way back by the federal trial, I left it off the election calendar and moved on. Next up was the other state case in Georgia, where Trump and his allies face racketeering charges. Prosecutors are saying that he and 18 others illegally sought to overturn his 2020 election loss in the state. Richard, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Where are you?
I'm right here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live and where I've been covering this Trump indictment for quite some time.
I call my colleague Richard Fausset.
It's a racketeering case, which describes this much broader conspiracy that involves all kinds of people, some of whom Trump probably never met, to really seek various ways to change the outcome of the election, with everyone sort of rowing in the same direction, allegedly, to achieve the same criminal purpose, which was to overturn the election results of 2020. So there were a lot of like sort of schemes afoot, according to prosecutors here, that were in essence illegal, that amounted to felonies in the state of Georgia. It's a really, really serious stuff for Trump and for a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tell me about the timeline of this case. What are the important dates to know when we think about how this might affect the calendar in 2024?
Sure. You're going to have the possibility of a trial starting in August. Fani T. Willis, the DA, said that that's when she'd like the case to start. And then perhaps to wrap up a trial in early 2025. I mean, I would add that there are a lot of asterisks to kind of place on those dates.
Wait, Willis has said this case could end in 2025?
She's saying that she's thinking that it's going to end in 2025. So, imagine, I mean, again, we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. There are going to be a lot of efforts to push this back, to derail it. Who knows what could happen. But if these are the dates that hold, August 2024, we start a trial. Then we're going to have November 2024, where we're going to have a general election, and then maybe a trial that culminates in early 2025.
Interesting. So this trial, as scheduled, will happen squarely in the thick of the general election next year.
That's the thought.
I mean, I'm going to pose a question I also posed to Jonah. In terms of your case, specifically when we think about Georgia, if you could kind of put on a scale of 1 to 10 for me, how you would rate Trump's chances of being convicted before Election Day in this case, how would you answer that?
Oh, gosh. I feel kind of weird trying to offer an answer to that.
No, you can reject the premise. Feel free.
Yeah. Well, but here's why I want to reject the premise. I mean, it's like trying to it's like trying to handicap a football game. The reason I don't want to handicap it is like these are real lives involved here. Not just for President Trump. A lot of people could have their lives ruined by this, or they could be vindicated by it.
Mm-hmm. When it comes specifically to the 2024 election, when I talk to you and to Jonah, it kind of makes me feel like, for at least for my purposes of what to untangle, that the federal cases might be more important or at least more central to the early part of the calendar next year. And I think part of the reason I say that is because Jonah pointed out that that's the one that's scheduled to start first, at least right now.
Well, yeah, now it's just in the last few days that we've started to see some of these suggestions or proposals for dates from the district attorney. And, it looks like, she's not really trying to elbow her way to the front to go first.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good way to think about this, is that it probably won't go first.
Richard, thank you so much for helping us out. And I hope to hang out with you in Georgia soon.
Yeah, come on down and see me instead. Thanks for talking to me.
So after talking to Richard and Jonah, it seemed like they were in agreement. Yes, the state cases matter. But when it comes to 2024 and what's going to happen to Trump before Election Day, those aren't really the cases to watch, at least as of right now. What could really upend everything next year are the federal cases. Can you introduce yourself and tell me what you do?
Sure. My name is Alan Feuer.
And the expert on those is my colleague, Alan Feuer.
I have been covering the hundreds of criminal cases resulting from the January 6th attack on the Capitol for over 2.5 years, and that has transformed into covering the criminal cases brought against former President Trump.
Mm-hmm. Top line, can you explain to me what are they and how are they different than the state cases?
Sure. So the two federal cases brought by the special counsel, Jack Smith, one of them involves Trump's mishandling, illegal retention is the term of art, of more than 30 classified documents after he left office, and then a sort of plot to obstruct the government's attempts to get those documents back. Mm-hmm. The other case that Jack Smith has brought homes in on all the ways that Trump conspired to overturn the 2020 election after his loss to Joe Biden, culminating with the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Mm-hmm. So 2 federal cases, Trump's mishandling of classified documents and the allegations that he sought to overturn the election. Between the 2 of these cases, is there anyone that's going to be more particularly important when we think about how it could affect the presidential election in the short term?
Sure. You would have to say it would be the election interference case, only because that case is going to go to trial first. That case is very likely to go in front of a jury, for 2, maybe as long as 3 months before the Republican National Convention and the nominating process. The classified documents case is, at this point, it is absolutely going to happen after the election interference case, and it's very possible the documents case may not see a courtroom until after the 2024 election.
Okay, this is really helpful information. You're saying that this January 6th case is the one that's scheduled to go to trial the soonest. When is that trial date?
So the election interference case is now scheduled to start on March 4.
Or March 4th?
March 4th, 2024.
That's before Super Tuesday.
Yes. And so you're talking about, a couple of weeks of jury selection. So that case could begin in earnest, sort of, if all goes according to the schedule that is now in place, by mid-March. That trial is expected to last between 2 and 3 months, something like that. So if you cast forward from mid-March, now you're in mid-April, mid-May, maybe you're into mid-June, right? Maybe. And so that case is likely to go to the jury and a verdict to be returned before the nominating convention in July. And I would probably say at this point, barring the unforeseen, Trump will be convicted in that case. I think his best shot at not being convicted is to get, one or more jurors not to agree with their peers and get a hung jury, in which case they'll have to do it all again. But, the fact that I have watched over, hundreds and hundreds of these January 6th related cases in the federal district court in Washington, there has been 2 out of over 500 that have resulted in acquittals. 98.9% have been guilty verdicts. And I think playing the odds, Trump will end up in the same position.
This feels like 2 big pieces of information in our quest to kind of figure out how Trump's legal problems are going to affect the presidential election next year. One, you're saying that come March, Donald Trump is likely to be involved in a 2 to 3 month process of a public trial on charges that he overturned the election, and that there is likely, in your estimation, to be a conviction in that case based on the kind of previous way these cases go. And that could all happen before the nominating convention in July.
Yes. At that point, the sentencing process will begin. And, in the federal courts, 3 months is not an insanely short time to kind of go through the process of filing sentencing papers to the judge and working out all the kinks until an actual sentencing date is set and everybody gathers in court and the judge hands down a sentence. So in theory, if a guilty verdict is secured in the election interference case before the nominating convention, it is within the realm of reason to think that Donald Trump will also be sentenced in that case before the election is even held. There is really one big potential wrinkle that could derail the schedule for the election interference case. And that is Trump has sought to have the charges dismissed by claiming that he is absolutely immune to the allegations in the indictment under the theory of executive immunity. And what does that mean? It simply means that all the things that he did to stave off his defeat to Joe Biden took place while he was still president. So his lawyers are arguing he can't be charged with behavior that was undertaken as part of his official duties as president. And he's trying to say that, he wasn't seeking to illegally overturn the election. He has flipped that script and is saying he was seeking as president to fulfill his legal duties to preserve the integrity of the election. He will probably lose that argument in the trial court in Washington, D.C. And in fact, he might lose that argument imminently. But Trump's lawyers will absolutely appeal those arguments. And they have the right to make an immediate appeal, first to the federal appeals court in D.C., and then ultimately to the Supreme Court. So the lawyers are thinking that they may be able to buy sufficient time with those appeals, that the March date may be pushed back, and that the trial, instead of being concluded before the nominating convention, will either bleed into the convention or even take place after the convention. And what will happen at that point is it will get very uncomfortable to obligate Donald Trump to be in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. for 2 to 3 months during the home stretch of the campaign.
Wow. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
And so
there's a race for the convention. If he's not the Republican nominee, then I guess it could become legally easier or maybe politically easier to kind of force him to be in one space at one time. But he stops being the former president and starts being the next Republican nominee at that convention. And you're saying, for this case specifically, the two sides have dueling incentives about the speed and likelihood of this trial.
Yes, absolutely. So it is not a deal breaker if the election interference case bleeds into what we think of as the heart of the campaign, August, September, right? It's not a deal breaker. It just gets really bumpy and super uncomfortable, and we're in a place that we've never been before.
You mentioned Washington, D.C., where this trial will take place. How does that factor in? And will this be a jury trial? Or are we talking about a collection of peers from D.C. who will be judging Trump in this case?
I mean, by all accounts, it will be a jury trial. It will be a D.C. jury. It is, at least in theory, possible that Trump could ask to have this case heard by the judge alone, although I think that would never happen because she has issued several rulings that Trump has found unfavorable. And so it is almost certain to go in front of a D.C. jury. And just by the odds, a D.C. jury is unlikely to be super sympathetic to Donald Trump. And so then you've got the likelihood of a conviction. And it's just a matter of, a sentence. Once there's a conviction, there's a sentence, period. There's going to be a sentence.
I guess it's still setting in for me.
Yeah.
You're saying there's a real chance that Donald Trump is sentenced to actual prison time before the election day in the January 6th case.
So my answer to that is probably but, right? So yes, it is absolutely 100% possible that Donald Trump will be sentenced to a significant amount of federal prison time before the 2024 election is held. The but is this sort of asterisk about the presidential immunity appeal that could delay that case and throw off the timeline. And then, of course, let's not forget, if Trump wins the election.
Yeah, this is where I'm going.
Even with a conviction on his shoulders and even with a sentence hanging over his head for significant prison time, he could, of course, attempt to pardon himself, commute his sentence, and, effectively have the case nullified. Now, that too is untested ground. That too may be an issue that the Supreme Court has to weigh in on. But what if Trump wins the election? The political power and the levers of control that will be at his disposal could, in theory, absolutely reverse the significant consequences that the election interference case imposed on him.
In fact, as I hear, you hear now and folks I talked to earlier, it increasingly seems like the only way for Trump to wiggle out of all of this, as y'all are laying out, seems to be to win the election.
It's certainly the best way.
Well, I'm going to finish with, the kind of questions I also asked Jonah and Richard, and I have a sense of kind of how you'll answer, but I still want to know. If you could rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate Trump's chances of being convicted before Election Day in the federal cases?
Well, if you don't hold me to my answer, I would say, all right, I would say the chances that he is convicted in the January 6th election interference case before the election, 8.5.
Wow. And documents?
I don't think that case goes to trial before the election. So that would be a 0 then. That said, if it does go to trial before the election, I would say 6.
And if he is convicted, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the chances he would be sentenced before Election Day in the January 6th case?
9.5. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean locked up, by the way. That means the sentence has been imposed.
That's where I'm going, is even if there is a sentence imposed, what would be the likelihood that he would see any type of prison sentence before Election Day?
0.
Okay.
I don't think the judge in Washington, with a conviction in front of her and a significant sentence on the books, would then literally lock Donald Trump up before the election. That would be highly unusual.
This is really helpful. I mean, I feel like I get the question so much of what do these cases mean? And it's so hard to answer that because there's so many permutations possible. And I think what you're giving me really adds up to something that's really important for people to understand, that by the time Donald Trump gets to even next summer, this could be a figure who is a convicted criminal.
I mean, it is totally possible, and I think leaning towards likely that the Republican nominating convention is going to have to decide whether or not they want a convicted federal felon as their nominee.
Yeah. Let's just sit with that for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And I'll leave the politics to you, whether or not they decide to do it.
Yeah, no, see, like, this is helpful because I'm about to call up Maggie Haberman right now and be like, this sounds crazy. So, thank you for doing this and helping us sort through this. I appreciate your time, Alan.
All right. Thanks, Ested.
More after the break. After digging into these cases, my calendar was getting pretty full, especially in March, when the federal trial in the January 6th case is scheduled to begin, the day before Super Tuesday. And it could all come to a head before Election Day and even before the Republican convention. So considering all of this, I wanted to talk through the political implications with someone who'd know. Hello, how's it going? We're matching.
I know.
How's it going? I'm so excited for this. My colleague, Maggie Haberman. Thank you so much for doing this. Can you first introduce yourself and tell me about what you cover?
I am Maggie Haberman. I'm a senior political correspondent at the New York Times. I cover Trump and primarily the Republican Party right now, as well as the investigations into Trump.
And what year are you going on of like Trump coverage continuously?
Continuously, I'm going into year 9, I think, because it started in May of 2015. Non-continuous is much longer than that, but the most in earnest began in February of 2011 when he was thinking of running, and then that was the year he did his birth or lie about President Obama.
You've been like informally given Trump Whisperer nickname. Do you like that?
No, I hate that.
I would imagine you hate that.
I've always hated it. It makes me...
Can you tell me why you hate it?
Yes, because it's not true. It is one, because it confers a level of wrong-handed intimacy that does not exist. And I think that, having covered someone and understanding them is not the same as, sort of mentally manipulating them, which is what that moniker implies.
Yeah. We don't love the psychodrama of it all. You're reporting.
Correct. And I very much appreciate you asking me that.
One of the reasons we're doing this episode is because I feel like in campaign ecosystem, I've kind of blocked out some of the legal problems facing him. Because for voters, it's been hard to really untangle. And we've spent really today doing some of that untangling work. I've talked to our colleagues who are really focused on the legal aspects of each of the cases. And I was hoping that you could put into context the political impacts of the cases and specifically how Trump's legal problems are affecting the campaign. People speculated that the whole reason Trump was running again this time was because of some of the legal problems he faced. I guess one of my first questions is do you think there's truth to that?
I do. That's definitely part of it. To be clear, he started talking about running again well before January 6th, 2021. Mm-hmm. So he was already looking at another campaign, but there are a number of people who are very close to him who have said that they believe that he is running because he knows that it could give him some level of insulation against his legal cases, and not because there's any kind of actual legal defense wrapped in a political campaign, but it gives him some armor in the court of public opinion, and potentially more than that if he wins.
Yeah. I mean, today I've learned a lot, and I think I kind of got hit with a ton of bricks about what next year's kind of calendar can look like. And Jonah, Richard, Alan, the folks I talked to, really came away with a couple takeaways. One was just the sheer scope of the charges and the severity of penalties we're talking about. Another big takeaway was the impact on his schedule for next year, that there would just be choices about where he will have to be. And the third was a real zeroing in on this January 6th case, at least in the short term, considering it's the first one that is scheduled to go to trial, and the other ones are somewhat less likely to be concluded before Election Day. Does your sense of the cases kind of align with those takeaways?
More or less, with one caveat, which is that the Trump team is pushing ahead with this presidential immunity argument on the J6 case.
Alan told me a little bit about that. Can you explain it?
Yeah, so this is a filing that they put forward, I think it was early October, and they're arguing that basically, everything that the president did, I'm generalizing here, but everything that the president did was within the scope of his job and that he is afforded these constitutional protections, and the expectation is that they will likely lose just because the judge in the case has generally not ruled with them. And it's a very sweeping, sort of the criticism of it is it's a king-like claim. If they lose, they will appeal it, and the effort on the appeal will be to try to get it to the Supreme Court. And then we don't know, A, if the Supreme Court will take it up, or B, if they do, how they will handle it. There has been nothing in how the Supreme Court has behaved so far on anything related to Trump's antics, attacking democracy and the democratic process that suggests that they will rule on his side. But even if they don't, that still has delayed by several weeks, the trial starting. So if that happens, the trial begins later in the year, which gets interesting because the Republican National Convention is mid-July.
I was going to ask you about the Republican convention because it seems like that legal calendar is set to get busy at the beginning of next year, kind of in the thick of the Republican primary will be starting, but it's careening towards the summer when the convention is happening. What do we know about how the campaign plans to navigate this period?
So I think that they don't have many set plans because they don't know what it's going to look like. But to the extent that they do, they don't think that it's the worst thing in the world that, and this will sound like spin, I don't actually think it is. They obviously don't think him being indicted is objectively great. They are making political hay out of it. But that if there has to be a trial next year, but having it come around the time of Super Tuesday, which could be the moment when some last person standing against Trump is making their case, they think this underscores again the issues that they have repeatedly highlighted for the Republican electorate that has galvanized the Republican electorate around Trump over the course of these four indictments. So if that happens, they see some advantage in it. What's not advantageous is he will have to sit in a courtroom every day. As a criminal defendant, you have to be there. This is not the same as the New York Attorney General's civil case related to his company. You can't, unless the judge gave him a waiver, which I would be very surprised by based on what she has said in the past in other rulings and on other matters related to this case. So assuming that she sticks with where she's been before, he is required to be there. And that is also, instead, why someone asked me this question recently, could he go back and forth between this trial and the documents trial in Florida? No, you have to physically be in one case. There are some pluses in that, which are, this will, again, sound strange, but Donald Trump is the most self-harming candidate I think I've ever seen. He is both his own best and worst enemy, and it can really limit some of his unscripted moments because he will be in a courtroom. It also guarantees that all eyes will be on him. It allows him to leave the courtroom, which I don't expect will be televised despite a request from media outlets that was supported by Trump. It would not be keeping with precedent. So then you're going to be limited to what Trump says about it because the prosecutors are not going to be spinning their side of it. That's not how federal prosecutors work. And so Trump, unless he is completely gagged, which would be very, very fraught if that were to happen politically, he has the ability to go and do a press conference and say whatever he wants, and he will get maximum media attention. And it's not as if there's going to be somebody, as I said, it's not just Jack Smith, who's going to rebut him. It's not like President Biden can go out and do that. So that creates this bizarre dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's important to kind of sit on. You're like, I think the intuitive thought would be when you see this calendar and say that they could be starting a federal trial at the same time that people are going to vote on Super Tuesday for the Republican nominee, you would think that that would be bad for him. But because they've kind of created a situation where they think these indictments actually bring Republicans to his side, you're saying they're not thinking it's all bad at the prospect of a March trial.
No, correct. And frankly, it's not just that they think it, it's that the empirical data shows it. Okay. Jonathan Swan and I, along with some other colleagues, did a story looking at the indictment effect. And it was how media coverage blacked out every other candidate. It was how Republican-based voters came to see him as under attack. It was how the fundraising apparatuses of the various party committees swung into action fundraising off these indictments. And so you put all of this together, And it has created a pretty powerful dynamic within the Republican Party. There are going to be plenty of independents potentially and plenty of suburban voters potentially who do not favor having an indicted candidate, and it might seem more real to them next year. I don't know what it'll look like with a criminal conviction that seems like a real chance too. But I understand why they feel like this helps them at least in the short term.
To secure the nomination.
Certainly to secure the nomination, and they know these are their circumstances. They're not convinced, many of them will privately acknowledge, they're not convinced this helps them in the general election the same way that it did in the primary, but they have also made the point, and I think it's a fair one, that we are seeing a series of unprecedented events in our political life in this country, and predictions might be a fool's errand.
The other thing I saw when I read the story about how conviction might change things was it read as if Donald Trump's advisor or campaign was expecting to be convicted in the January 6th case. Is that true?
Most people I talk to around Trump expect that it's going to be very hard for him to win an acquittal in that case. It's possible they could get a hung jury, but I think an acquittal, it's a very tall order.
I feel like it is an underrated fact of next year's election, not only like the scope and impact of these trials, but then we're essentially talking about an agreed premise between both inside the campaign and the folks covering it, that he's likely to be someone who is a convicted criminal come Election Day.
I think that's very much the reality, and I don't think that it's not something that exists because we're saying it. It's something that I think is just the way this is trending.
Yeah.
Events are just rolling along.
Once these trials get underway, how do you expect it to affect what we would consider the traditional Trump presidential campaign?
I think that there is no separation between the Trump campaign and the legal operation right now. They are completely fused. And I expect that will continue. He has for months fused these indictments into his political messaging. Yep. It's been part of every fundraising email, literally almost every fundraising email. He talks about it on the stump. He talks about it in fundraising speeches. He talks about it in every interview that he does. He rails about it on Truth Social, his site, repeated times a day. So I don't actually expect that it's going to look that different. I think it's just going to look like more of the same with more intensity.
Yeah. You alluded to this earlier, but what do we know about whether in the general election voters may see these indictments versus convictions any differently? I know y'all were reporting on that.
So we had a poll, the Times had a poll a couple of weeks ago, and there was a fascinating figure in it, which was, in a sea of pretty bad news for Joe Biden, or at least questionable news for Joe Biden. One of the bright spots was that there is a very small sliver of voters, it was 6%, said roughly 6%, it wasn't even on the nose, said they would switch their votes from Trump to Biden and that was how the question was asked, if Trump is convicted and convicted and sentenced before Election Day. So it's a very specific, discrete fact set. And that could swing the election just because, as you and I have been discussing for years, these are closely fought, closely decided elections, which means that every marginal factor is a real factor. And so this could be one too. I think that it's very possible that because this is such a distant thought for people, when it is more top of mind, they will vote in greater numbers against Donald Trump.
I think that rings really true because mostly when people talk to us about it, wherever we are, it is in confusion. They know that these things have vaguely happened, but it's...
Who knows where it goes?
Who knows where it goes, or can he still run, and things like that.
I get a lot of that.
I get a lot of what does it mean about his own... And one question I wanted to pose to you that I get is, how are all of these cases and the kind of threat of prison or sentencing landing in Trump world? We talk to so many Trump supporters, and their initial reaction is just often to dismiss them, say it's kind of, a bunch of nothing. Is that similar on the inside, or how are they, reacting to the prospect of keeping their supporters at bay if he is, on trial publicly?
Most of the people who are closest to Trump in his campaign, I'm not talking about the attenuated orbit and the extended orbit, but most of the people who are directly in his orbit, even if they think that he made decisions that were unwise, like not returning those documents when the feds asked repeatedly, they are almost radicalized by these indictments. They are very angry that he's been indicted. They're very angry that Walt Nauta, his personal aide, was indicted.
So you've seen that transition from them through this year. They've been radical.
100%.
Interesting.
There is an enormous amount of anger that he is where he is, that his co-defendants are where they are, and that the collective orbit is where it is. And one of his skills, for lack of a better term in life, Donald Trump's, is getting people to go out and fight for him. And you're going to see that a lot.
You know, Kristen Welker on NBC asked Trump in a recent interview, do you worry about going to jail? And he kind of brushed it off. Is there any reporting that speaks to his feelings of that question? Should we take him at his word when he says that that's not something he thinks about?
No, we should not take him at his word that this is not something he thinks about. He rails about the indictments privately with frequency. Someone once said to me that, this was clear in the 2016 campaign that the sun was always shining in Trump land. And that is very much what he's all about. It's all about the image, and it's all about what you project. Project strength, project toughness, project nothing is bothering you. It's how he got through bankruptcies in the 1990s. It's how he has come back from every embarrassment and moment that would shame other people into changing their behavior. And so he pours an enormous amount of energy into portraying himself as just fine. He is not just fine, and he's not just okay. He is extremely worried about these cases, and I think that may become more apparent in his public behavior as we get closer to trial.
Yeah. Obviously the facts of the January 6th case are quite, things we saw publicly about the kind of attempts to overturn the election, his rhetoric at the time, and obviously the threat and the reality of violence that we saw at the Capitol on that day. When we think about next year, I think for a lot of Americans, they still associate Trump with the ability to summon that type of violence and anger. I mean, I know we don't want to predict violence. We don't want to predict anger. I also wonder, is this still a candidate or person whose victimhood is often expressed by their supporters in those ways? I'm kind of should I be scared?
I think that we have seen, it's funny, there's a lot of discussion right now about where does Trump fall on the spectrum of Trump's behavior, right?
Yeah.
So is he worse?
Yeah.
Is he saying worse things? When I say worse, that's what I mean. I think he is more intensely attacking people domestically than he did in 2016. But, he was offering to pay for people's legal fees if they punched protesters at his rallies, and he was admiring autocrats and dictators, and he has always been this person. It's not as if he suddenly has changed. I do think that what has changed since 2021 is we are surrounded by an intensifying climate of political violence. There's just no question about that. You're seeing it in increased threats on institutions, on judges, on the FBI, on really every mainstream institution. And so what has clearly been a deterrent, I would say on the flip side, is all of these January 6th arrests. Okay. All of these arrests of rioters. Trump has tried to call for, defend me, rise up in the middle of his indictments, and it hasn't really happened.
Right. We were outside the courthouse after the Bragg indictment, and it wasn't really like that.
No, and that was the one where he really did try to call for, summon people.
Yeah, and I feel like, in our own calibration, it's does that mean people are cooling, or does that mean that something like a trial would activate? And I don't think we know that answer.
We don't know.
But it is interesting because there was a kind of, F around and find out about January 6th where people...
That's well put. No, that's right. No, that's right.
Sorry.
Listen, there's been close to 1,000, if not over at this point, 1,000 arrests.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people. For this reason, is that the government took the position that if you do not follow through with this, that people are not going to understand that the rule of law needs to be followed.
Yeah.
And so I do think that has been a deterrent for people because people don't really want to get arrested on his behalf in the same numbers that they might have wanted to run into the Capitol because it seemed like a good time.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
I can even say from the anecdotal social, I'm in Trump Facebook groups and such. The level of energy is not the same.
No, it's different.
And you wonder what next year does to it either way.
Correct. And I don't think we can predict. And I could make an argument in either direction.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
By the end of the day, I did have a clear sense of what the 2024 calendar could look like. Starting with the January 6th trial, likely to begin in March. But there's a lot of things we can't predict when it comes to Trump and the legal troubles he faces. Like what happens to these trials next summer if Trump becomes the Republican nominee. And then, what would happen after Election Day if he wins? Spoiler, nobody knows. That's the run-up for Thursday, November 30th, 2023. Now, the rundown.
So, when I ran for governor, I really was Nikki Who. No one knew who I was. No one
This
gave me
week,
a chance.
at a town hall in their home state of South Carolina, former Governor Nikki Haley drew the largest crowd of her campaign.
Now listen, there is nothing I would love more than to tell you Biden did that to us. And Biden has sent us down this socialism roller coaster that's dangerous, that we have to stop. But I've always spoken in hard truths, and I'm going to do that with you today. Our Republicans did that to us too.
In front of more than 2,000 people, the GOP presidential hopeful focused on more than just Democrats, but also her own party and her chief rival, Donald Trump.
I was proud to serve America in his administration, and I agree with a lot of his policies. But the truth is, rightly or wrongly, chaos follows him. You know I'm right. Chaos follows
Haley also picked up the endorsement of Americans for Prosperity Action, the influential conservative super PAC founded by the billionaire Koch brothers. Despite her good week, Trump is still polling roughly 47 points above the rest of the pack. Meanwhile,
I'm all in. Count on it.
You would do a 2-hour debate with Ron DeSantis.
I would make it 3.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, another one of Trump's rivals, is going head-to-head tonight with Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom of California in a red state versus blue state debate moderated by Sean Hannity of Fox News.
You heard Gavin make the offer. Your answer is?
Absolutely. I'm game. Let's get it done. Just tell me when and where. We'll do it. And here's the thing, Sean.
We are 6 weeks and 4 days from the Iowa caucuses and 341 days from the general election. We'll see you next week. The Run-Up is reported by me, Ested Herndon, and produced by Elisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, and Alicia Itu. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Caitlin Love. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Haufinger, Mahima Chablani, Renan Borelli, Jeffrey Miranda, and Maddie Masiello. If you have questions about the 2024 election, we're working on a new Q&A segment, and we want to hear from you. Email us at therunup@nytimes.com. And finally, if you like the show and want to get updates on our latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts.